We'll talk now about Guantanamo Bay detainee policy. Joining us here in Washington is Devon Chaffee, advocacy counsel for a group called Human Rights First. Let's start with you. The President speaks today on anti-terror policy. What are you looking to hear from him?
Well, I think that we're looking for increased leadership in calling and supporting for the closure of Guantanamo. Clearly the President and the Democrats in Congress have confronted increased opposition to the closure of the facility. Much of this opposition is based on really illegitimate claims about the risks of bringing detainees into the United States for trial, which is something that we do all the time, that we often seek extradition of terrorists to bring to justice here in the United States. We hope that President Obama will reiterate his commitment to close the Guantanamo Bay facility within a year and to bring individuals who are detained there that might be suspected of terrorist crimes to trial here in U.S. federal criminal courts.
Joining us from out in Denver is Cully Stimson, who is a former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Detainee Affairs, had that position from 2004 to 2007. And Mr. Stimson, one of the show folks, USA Today headline, it says that Obama's anti-terrorism policies are hitting some walls. What's your view of those walls? What's happening in your view?
What's happening is the President has evolved from candidate Obama to President Obama. And President Obama now gets the presidential daily brief from the CIA director and others. He understands the threat that these detainees pose and other threats to our country. And so he is taking his time, working through the detainee task force and other organizations that he's set up to study this problem, and he needs to take his time because these are very real threats. And the politics of it, Paul, are interesting, but what you're seeing is not only just Republicans, but Democrats. Senator Harry Reid and others are saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Not so fast. Don't close this place down until you give us a detailed plan. So I think today you're going to hear President Obama talk about the values that our country has, the establishment of the rule of law, the need to maximize liberty and security, but he's not going to lay out a detailed plan today.
We invite viewers to phone in with their questions and comments for our guests. We have three lines, one for Democrats, one for Republicans, one for independents. The topic here is Guantanamo Bay detainee policy. Joining us from the Cable Center in Denver this morning is Cully Stimson, former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Detainee Affairs. And here in Washington is Devon Chaffee, advocacy counsel for Human Rights First. And Devon Chaffee wanted to show you a couple of headlines here. One of them is from the Washington Times, and they focus on the FBI Director Robert Mueller, who was on the Hill yesterday, and his testimony on all of this. And he said Wednesday that he had several concerns about bringing detainees into the U.S. prisons as the Senate voted overwhelmingly to withhold funding to shutter the U.S. Navy-run facility in Cuba. That was a big Senate vote yesterday. What do you make of what you've heard of the FBI director's testimony?
Well, first, with regards to the amendment that was passed yesterday, it's a limited amendment. It only applies to funding in this bill or prior bills, and it certainly leaves open the possibility that funding can be appropriated to bring detainees to the United States, particularly to bring detainees to the United States for trial. Of course, there are obstacles and risks that need to be addressed when bringing individuals into the United States for trial, and there are risks that need to be mitigated. However, as a number of Obama administration officials and Department of Defense officials have recognized, it's unlikely that we'll be able to close the Guantanamo facility without bringing detainees to the United States. And in fact, as a number of senators, including Senator Durbin, recognized yesterday, we try detain terrorist suspects in the United States successfully and safely all the time. In the past decade, I think we've successfully tried over 120 complex international terrorism cases in U.S. federal criminal courts, and there are a number of highly dangerous individuals being detained in highly dangerous terrorist suspects being detained in U.S. prisons securely today. We need to have faith in our Federal Bureau of Prisons and in our federal criminal justice system to handle these cases.
Cully Stimson, give you a chance to reflect on that Senate vote again yesterday. They voted to withhold any money for closing of Guantanamo. But when you get to that word plan, looking for something from the President, what should the plan be in your view?
Well, first off, let me just correct one thing you said, Paul. I was in office in 2006 and 7, not starting in 2004.
Gotcha,
but
thanks.
Yeah, sure. The plan, which has not been rolled out to the public, is taking time to develop. The detainee task force is hearing from a number of individuals behind closed doors. They're not making the list public yet of the people. I understand they're hearing from a wide variety of views, and so they don't even hand in their homework assignment to the president for a couple months. And so I don't think you're going to see some people on the Hill satisfied that the president checked the box and delivered today with a detailed plan. And that's probably how the politics will play out. One side will say, or some people will say, yeah, it was detailed enough for me, go ahead and let's pony up the money to close it. Others will say, no, let's wait to see what the detainee task force says. And so, one thing that Devon said is right. I mean, I don't think anyone is criticizing the Federal Bureau of Prisons' ability to detain high-value folks. I mean, here in Colorado, where I am right now, we have a Supermax facility that has some of the world's more notorious folks who are terrorists. The question, though, I think that the FBI director posed and teased up was, does it increase the threat level in and around that facility and in the United States by bringing them here? And I think some reasonably think yes, and others say no.
Devon, Chaffee, want to clarify? Want to add to that?
Well, I think we need to look to successful prosecutions in the past, and we need to learn from the lessons over the past decade or a number of decades, and our ability to safely secure these individuals in prisons without subjecting the surrounding communities to dangers. I think that we have successfully detained dangerous terrorists in the past. We're currently safely and securely detaining terrorist suspects in U.S. federal prisons, and I think that we should be able to do so with detainees from Guantanamo. It shouldn't be that different.
Let's get to our calls for our guests. Bay City, Michigan, you are up first. James on the Republican line. Hi there.
Good morning.
Morning.
One thing I don't understand, like this little lady here wants to bring these prisoners over here. Why do we bring them over here, but you leave them in Guantanamo? They've been treated like a king over there. They're getting medical attention. We have representatives going over there and saying, geez, everything is great here. They're treated beautifully. Why do you want to bring them here in our prisons for? Leave them over there.
All right, question there for Devon Chaffee. He was Advocacy Council for Human Rights First. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I think that while conditions at Guantanamo have clearly improved over the past year or a couple of years, Guantanamo has rightfully become a symbol for abusive torture and other cruel forms of interrogation. It is clear from the reports that have come out from the Senate Armed Services Committee, from the memos that were released, that very abusive interrogation techniques were used in Guantanamo. And in fact, that's cited as one of the potential obstacles to bringing some of the detainees that are suspected of terrorist crimes to justice, because they were so severely tortured that they might not be able to be brought to trial. So I think there is a reason why Guantanamo has become a symbol for policies of torture. And so when we say that that detainees at Guantanamo are treated like kings, I think that's somewhat of a mischaracterization of how detainees have been treated at the facility. Why is it important for these detainees to be brought to the United States? Well, first, I think it's important that detainees that are suspected of terrorist crimes be brought to justice. It's what the American people deserve, and it's what our federal criminal justice system is set up to do. And so individuals, as well as the fact that if we're looking to our allies to help us solve this problem, to help resettle a number of the detainees that have been cleared for release, where either this administration or the past administration have determined that they never committed hostile acts against the United States. They were clearly picked up by mistake, and so we need to find a way to dispose of those detainees. We're looking to our allies to help with that effort. It's very difficult for our allies to help with that effort if we don't demonstrate that we are also willing to take detainees into the United States. And taking some of these detainees into the United States will increase cooperation from our allies in helping to deal with this problem.
Cully, Stimson out in Denver, I'll give you a chance to react to that. But first, can you clarify something for us? Are additional detainees allowed to be housed at Guantanamo at this point?
Are they allowed? Sure.
Yeah.
That's a policy question for the president. I mean, he has the sole authority to authorize additional detainees coming to Guantanamo. For instance, over 200, 300 very high-value al-Qaeda and Iraq detainees are housed in Iraq. He could order them to be brought there if he thought that they were going to be released by the Iraqis or not tried properly. The same goes for Afghanistan. So there's no bar to bringing more detainees to Guantanamo. We haven't seen additional detainees brought to Guantanamo since President Obama took office, and I highly doubt that he's going to focus on the inbounds. He's going to focus on getting them off the island and closing the facility. But I will touch on some of what Devon said. Devon's out of the mainstream. Her organization is out of the mainstream. The latest poll shows that James, the caller from Michigan, that 55% of Americans don't want him here in the United States. There's good reason for that. No, they're not going to break out of any federal facility. And yes, we should use the federal courts for some of these cases. We do have a terrific record in trying federal terrorists in federal courts. I mean, I'm a former federal prosecutor. I'm proud of our system. But the mantra, torture, torture, torture at Gitmo is simply not true. We had a total of 780 guys there started in 2002. We're way down to 240 now, so obviously more have left than are there. 2 detainees, Slahi and Katani, were subject to enhanced interrogation techniques back in 2003. It was for a matter of weeks, and that was it. The interrogations at Guantanamo were subject to the Army Field Manual. Were there misdeeds that were taken care of through the administrative and UCMJ by guards against detainees early on? Yes. But the care and treatment of detainees at Gitmo is superior to most treatment of defendants in jails and prisons around the United States. The other thing the president needs to explain to the American people is why military commissions, upgraded military commissions, are an appropriate vehicle for some number of these detainees. He hasn't made that case yet. He needs to make that case. Otherwise, I think many will be calling for greater use of the federal courts, like Galani, who he's pushing up to the Southern District of New York for his alleged involvement in the '98 Kenya and Tanzania bombings.
Chicago, you are up now. I'll ask you to hold your thought just for a sec because I'm running low on calls here. But Chicago, Doris, you're on the line. Democrats line, go ahead.
Yeah, this gentleman is the very reason that we're in the shape we're in the world and with our security. You're going to see more and more calls for Harry Reid to resign. And I really want to congratulate the 6 senators that grew a spine. We had my senator, Senator Durbin, Tom Harkin, Patrick Leahy, Carl Levin, Jack Reed, and Shelton Whitehouse. And you're going to see more and more people confront Harry Reid.
Thanks for calling. Those were the 6 Democrats who voted against the Guantanamo closure funding amendment. But let's give Devon Chaffee a chance to follow up on some of the comments. Go ahead.
Well, as far as being out of the mainstream, I think it's certainly an out of the mainstream assertion that the interrogation techniques that were used against Katani in Guantanamo did not amount to cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment and or torture. He was subjected to severe stress positions, frigid temperatures, sleep deprivation, a number of abusive techniques in combination that certainly in the opinion of my organization and the opinion of many others amounts to what would be considered criminal acts of torture under U.S. law and international law. As far as bringing detainees into the United States, there are individuals who are clearly brought to Guantanamo by mistake, individuals that the Bush administration recognized never committed hostilities against the United States. In particular, there's a group of Chinese Uyghurs detained at Guantanamo that have been, a federal district court judge has ordered their release into the United States. There are resettlement communities that have offered to help reintegrate them into Uyghur communities that already exist here in the United States. Uyghur communities within the United States that are willing to help these individuals reintegrate. I think it's clear that there are ways in which any potential risk posed by these detainees that were clearly brought to Guantanamo by mistake, that clearly do not pose a threat to the United States, can be mitigated if they are brought within U.S. territory.
Let's hear from San Diego for a moment here. John, independent caller. You're on with Devon, Chaffee, and Cully Stimson. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Stimson. She's talking about working with our allies. Why don't we send those Chinese detainees back to China and let them take care of them? Oh, that's right. They might torture them and kill them. That's what I've been hearing. And what have we been doing with the people we've been catching on the battlefields lately? Do we just leave them in Afghanistan or leave them in Iraq? Or what do we do? Send them back to China?
Cully Stimson.
John, good question. In Iraq, they're no longer security internees or POWs. They're just defendants, criminal defendants, and they're detained in Iraq if there's probable cause they committed a crime. In Afghanistan, hostilities continue, and we detain them in facilities in Afghanistan, and we don't bring any to Guantanamo. And so it's a good question. With respect to the Uyghurs, that's right. We have an obligation under international law not to turn somebody over to a country where it's more likely than not that they would be tortured. Paul, if I could just quickly touch on three things Devon said. I agree with Devon with respect to the treatment of Detainee. It was wrong. It was certainly cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. I was against it, and if I was asked as a lawyer, should it be approved? Absolutely not. And the same for Slahi. Clearly, the administration was confronted with detainees who didn't whip out their Geneva-compliant ID card early on, or ever, for that matter. This enemy is different than all other enemies we've dealt with. And so we started releasing people from Guantanamo within weeks of them getting there in 2002, and the glide path out in terms of numbers has been down and down. And as to the lady from Chicago, I think she's putting her finger on an important issue. Congress has been highly reluctant for the last 8 years to jump in and weigh in on the detainee debate, although they've certainly been there to criticize. And we're seeing, I think, some hypocrisy from the very people who have saying close, 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 and now they're saying, oh, wait, we need our plan, and we need our detailed plan. And so there may be political consequences to this, but as Devon said early on, and she's right, the request for money was denied this time, but I think that they're going to be open arms for that type of money later on.
Let's go to a short portion of yesterday's Senate floor debate on the future of Guantanamo. We hear here from South Dakota Republican Senator John Thune, who speaks out in favor of keeping the facility open.
As I noted last week in a speech on the floor, President Obama told us when he issued his January 22nd executive order to close Guantanamo that he would work with Congress on any legislation that might be appropriate. But instead of consulting the Congress, the President has asked for $80 million to close Guantanamo with no justification or indication of any plan. Now, I believe that any plan to close Guantanamo that includes bringing these terrorists into the United States, Mr. President, is a mistake. We don't want the killers who are held there to be brought here into our communities. I think it's deeply troubling that not only does the administration wish to hold open the possibility that some of these detainees may be transferred to facilities here in American communities, it is even considering freeing some of them into American society.
Devon Chaffee back here in Washington. Human rights first. Any reaction to Senator Thune there?
Well, I would certainly state that as Mr. Stimson, as Cully noted earlier, the administration has indicated, and we saw reported on CNN last night, that it intends to bring some of the detainees from Guantanamo into the United States for trial, included Ahmed Golani for the embassy bombings. This follows a history of the co-conspirators for the embassy bombings were in fact indicted and successfully prosecuted in U.S. federal courts. Golani was indicted before ever being brought to Guantanamo for those crimes, and he should be tried in federal criminal courts within the United States. That's the correct place for him to be tried for the crimes that he is being accused of.
Carthage, Illinois, you are on the line now. Tim, Republican caller. What are your thoughts this morning?
Well, my question is most of those detainees were captured during wartime, so I don't understand why they are not being tried by a military tribunal. It, excuse me, it'd be almost like during World War II, during the trials of all the Nazis, is say, oh, we can't try them there. We have to bring them back to the United States and try them in federal court. I mean, I don't get all this. That's
Cully,
about all I got to say.
Cully Stimson in Denver, as a participant and observer of this system, can you explain military trials versus other types of trials and why one might be better than the other?
Sure. Military commissions have a long historical footprint in our American legal fabric. They are envisioned and spoken about in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The question is, what rules are you talking about? Clearly nobody, including Devon and other colleagues I have on the left, would agree that the rules that were used during the war crimes, the Nuremberg trials, would be adequate in today's jurisprudence. But when the Military Commissions Act of 2006 was passed, they attempted to model the rules mainly after the rules for court-martial and the military rules of evidence with some significant deviations. And it's this new administration who's saying that we want to upgrade those. But military tribunals are federal trials. They have been an abysmal failure, obviously. They have only prosecuted successfully 3 people. I don't think that you're going to see swift justice. Justice doesn't necessarily have to be swift to be correct and fair. But I think there's a preference, and you're starting to see it now in this administration, to push as many of these guys into federal district court as possible and then try some number of these folks in military commissions who were caught in unique circumstances on the battlefield, and those cases couldn't be brought successfully, at least according to the administration, in federal district court because of prohibitions against hearsay, Fourth and Fifth Amendment issues, etc. But the president needs to make that case to the American people, and I think also many on his left.
Devon, Chaffee wanted to throw this headline at you as well. It's a lead story today, actually, in the New York Times. Not sure if you had a chance to see it yet. It says 1 in 7 detainees rejoined jihad. This is a study from the Pentagon. They say an unreleased report at the Pentagon. About 1 in 7 of the 534 prisoners already transferred abroad from Guantanamo has returned to terrorism or militant activity, according to administration officials.
Yeah, no, actually, I did get to, was able to read that story this morning. I believe that the story also says that the reports and the lists of individuals, detainees that have returned, is virtually unverifiable. And that they have not been able to confirm what exactly these individuals are being accused of doing, or even necessarily confirm the identity of those individuals. Clearly, I haven't had the ability to review the report, which hasn't yet been released, except for my understanding to the New York Times. It hasn't been publicly released yet in full. But I believe that there are some concerns about the accuracy of some of the claims that are being made regarding that report. In addition, I think it's important to put the recidivism discussion in the context of what the negative repercussions of keeping Guantanamo open for our counterinsurgency efforts. As we know clearly from a number of defense experts and security experts, that Guantanamo has become a recruiting symbol for many enemies of the United States, including Al-Qaeda. And so you have to look at it not only in terms of, are there individuals who might return to the fight, but also how many individuals are joining the fight because we allow symbols like Guantanamo to continue to exist.
Cully Stimson, want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, actually collects data through a variety of means on Gitmo graduates, those who have returned to combatant activity. They have specific names of certain individuals. I think from the New York Times, as I was reading it in my bleary-eyed early morning here in Denver, I think the number was 27 confirmed names, and then a number of others suspected. So there are definitely some confirmations. I knew about that when I was in office. But Devon puts her finger on, I think, an important point, and that is, if this administration simply picks up some number of these detainees and brings them to the United States for military detention or some for prosecution, without addressing the broader challenges to its counterterrorism policy and retweaking and improving upon any deficiencies in the Bush detention framework, then they're just changing the zip code without fixing the problem. So they have the opportunity now to do that. And I think they're taking their time. My understanding is that they're hearing from a wide variety of folks. And I hope when they roll out their detailed plan that most can agree it's a safe way forward. And it does sort of get us past the Guantanamo chapter.
We have Rich on the line from Vermillion, Kansas, Democrats line. Hi there.
Well, I think the denying habeas corpus to people, arresting them and holding them in jail for 6 or 7 years without being brought before a judge, I think that's not very good. And the idea that we can't try them and try the most hardened prisoner at Guantanamo in a federal court, and if he's found guilty, house them in one of our federal prisons. I think that's nonsense that we couldn't do that safely. Thanks.
Let's hear from South Bend, Indiana now. William, you're on the Independence line. Hi.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I would like to agree completely with the young lady, Ms. Chaffee, that she is probably one of the very few people that speaks with common sense on this issue. It seems like the Democrats have lost their courage again for political reasons. Now, we're calling these men cold-blooded killers. My question has always been, where is the evidence? You are denying human beings the basic right to defend themselves. Simply putting a label on them and calling them cold-blooded killers does nothing and does not address the facts.
Cully Stimson, want to respond to that one?
Yeah, I mean, William, you bring up, I think, what a lot of people felt, especially early on in the war, and that is, well, they're not POWs really. The Bush administration is calling them the worst of the worst. How come you don't charge them or set them free? And the answer is that when you're not a party to the Geneva Conventions, you don't enjoy all of the protections of the Geneva Conventions, including the privilege of being called a prisoner of war. Recall, William, that during World War II, we had over 400,000 Nazi POWs here in the United States. Of course, during wartime, they didn't get access to federal courts and get a lawyer to challenge their detention. And so, at the time we were attacked on 9/11, the only Supreme Court case in existence dealing with alien combatants attempting to have access to our federal courts was a case called Johnson versus Eisentrager, a 1950 case, and the Supreme Court was very clear that they don't have access to courts. Now, that has proved to be a fatal mistake, but how would you know when you're trying to follow Supreme Court precedent? Now the detainees at Gitmo have the constitutional right to challenge their detention, and they've certainly received more procedural process than any prisoner of war in the history of mankind. The question going forward is that enough? Is it sustainable? And is it consistent with our values? But the mantra, try 'em or set 'em free, is a pure criminal law concept, not a law of war concept, which the Obama administration is going down.
What I have to... It's somewhat of a mischaracterization to say that the Guantanamo detainees have had, such an extensive process when they were in fact denied the process that the United States normally would give to an individual taken into custody in an armed conflict. They had procedures laid out in Army Regulation 190-8 that stems from obligations under Article 5 that a number of senior military lawyers wanted to employ in Afghanistan and for other detainees that were taken into custody that were eventually shipped to Guantanamo. Those processes weren't used. Instead, the process was very late. Some never even came before, some detainees at Guantanamo never came before a tribunal until years after they were taken into custody, far removed from where they were taken into custody and where, any ability to really sort out the facts of the circumstances of them being taken into custody. So I think that clearly that's part of why we wound up in the situation that we wound up in Guantanamo, where it clearly wasn't simply the worst of the worst, and in fact there were many mistakes made with detainees that were taken into custody.
Tom
Paul,
Hart,
if I could...
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll be quick. I agree and disagree with Devon. We should have offered Article 5 tribunal hearings at or near the point of capture. I'm a JAG in my reserve capacity. I think it should have been done. It was a no-brainer. We didn't do it. It was a mistake. But let's be clear about what that process entails. A field grade officer, a lieutenant commander or a major or above, at or near the point of capture, hears evidence. The guy gets no lawyer. It's a 5-minute hearing. It's a whiffy hearing. It's just like, what was he doing? Okay, okay, boom, he's detained. It is not like the things that they're getting today in terms of procedural protection. So, yes, we should have done it. No, it wouldn't have added more process than they've gotten today. But, yes, they have delayed the process, and I think that that has been a mistake.
Let me jump in and get another call, then we'll hear from Senator Harkin on the floor. But Palm Bay, Florida, you've been patient. Keith calling on the Republican line. Hi there.
Yes, I want to ask a question about the treaties of torture and the Geneva Convention. But first, I want to ask the lady a question. You said the biggest symbol for recruiting is Guantanamo. So was the base in Saudi Arabia, and the recruiting didn't stop. And now you want Guantanamo to be closed. You guys just don't get it. Isn't the biggest symbol the freedom of this country? Should we end the freedom in this country to stop them from recruiting? The question on the treaties, isn't it stated in these treaties that a government, you keep calling it torture, you don't even say implied in torture or whatever the legal term is for it, which we used to use in the media. Doesn't a government knowingly protect torture, that knowingly knowing that torture has been done by their government, doesn't the head of that government become a war crime criminal? And would you state that since President Obama doesn't want to prosecute anybody, isn't he a war criminal according to these treaties?
Let's hear from Devon Chaffee.
Well, first addressing the issue raised regarding the recruitment and use of Guantanamo as a recruiting tool, why we need to close the facility in order to remove that tool from the hands of our enemies. I think that we see in our military doctrine, in the counterinsurgency manual that was developed by General Petraeus, that one of the most important tools that we have in our counterinsurgency efforts is the rule of law, and upholding the rule of law and our reputation for adhering to the rule of law and humane treatment procedures. And what we have seen is that Guantanamo has become a symbol for attempts to circumvent the rule of law and for cruel treatment, because cruel treatment did occur there. Certainly, with regards to the issue of torture and our obligations to investigate crimes of torture, we do have an obligation under the Convention Against Torture to investigate alleged crimes of torture where there is substantial evidence of such crimes, and we also have obligations under the Geneva Conventions to investigate potential grave breaches of those conventions. So I do take the position that we have an obligation to investigate to see if crimes were committed.
Back to the Senate floor from yesterday on the future of Guantanamo. They voted on an amendment. They passed the amendment, but Senator Tom Harkin was one of 6 Democrats to vote against this Democratic amendment that stripped the funding to close Guantanamo. Here's a look at that.
It remains the case that there is simply no compelling reason to keep the facility open and not to bring the detainees to maximum security facilities here in the United States. This nation has long been a beacon of democracy and a champion of human rights throughout the world. Over the past 8 years, however, we have repeatedly betrayed our highest principles. Torture was authorized in direct violation of the law, and we intentionally put detainees beyond the most basic rules of law, including secret tribunals, where detainees lacked opportunities to challenge their confinement and lacked sufficient due process. These errors are manifested in the detention center at Guantanamo Bay, whose very purpose was to avoid providing legal safeguards that are enshrined in our Constitution and the Geneva Convention to detainees, and to prevent independent courts from reviewing the legality of the administration's actions. That was the purpose of Guantanamo as a detention center.
Cully, Stimson in Denver. Any reaction there to Senator Harkin?
Yeah, I'll pick up on one thing that the senator said. He said that there's no compelling reason to keep it open. I think what you're seeing, especially from Senator Harry Reid and others who've been reluctant to live up to their urging that we should close it in the vote yesterday, is that they believe that the security rationale for keeping Guantanamo open, at least for the time being, is still there unless and until the president lays out a comprehensive plan to close it. And, you know, to Keith's point, the previous caller, the impetuous to attack the United States didn't all of a sudden rise up like a summer thunderstorm when Guantanamo was stood up. Radical jihadists hate America. They hate the West. I mean, why did the embassy bombings happen in '98? Why was the Cole bombed? Why was the Khobar Towers bombed? Why did the first World Trade Center bombing? All of those terroristic acts occurred well before 9/11, and quite honestly, if you think that moving the detainees to a facility in the United States is going to stop the hatred of the West, you're smoking something, because they hate the West. They want to see the end of the West. And so this president, who's quite eloquent and I think rather gifted in that area, has the opportunity today and then later on when the task force releases its findings to lay out in I think very clear terms why the legacy costs of Guantanamo have outweighed the benefits, why it needs to close in an orderly process, why commissions play a small part, why the federal courts will play a part, and why military detention with periodic review of some of those detainees makes sense in their broader counterterrorism strategy.
More of the headlines out there. The Hill newspaper says Obama faces major test in Gitmo speech. Washington Post headline this morning as well says that Obama will try to quell concern on detainees. Speech today comes as Congress resists Guantanamo shutdown. We will cover the president's speech. We'll also be getting a speech by the former Vice President Dick Cheney. Keeping America safe is his topic. We'll cover them both and show them to you later. Fort Wayne, Indiana now. David on the line, the Democrats line. Hi there.
Hi. I live in Northeast Indiana. And what I'd like to say is I'm surrounded by very dangerous people. All I have to do is punch in registered sex offender. There's 35 within a mile of my home. I don't fear these guys. Let them go to court, have their day, do their time. You can park them next door to me as long as I know they're here. I don't fear them. They're cowards.
All right, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Tony, you're calling.
Yeah, how you doing this morning? Hey, I'm like the guy just left off. I live down here in Baton Rouge, and I want to let you know we also live around a lot of different type of people, terrorists, Klansmen, all kinds of stuff, and I'm not afraid myself. And for the gentleman to show all this weakness, it's just unbelievable. And the lady that sit there and have all this strength is unbelievable too at this time. I just want to, I just think that our country is big enough to accept a few terrorists to come in here. We can assemble, take care of them just fine here. Keep Open had a show on last night that was showing that the people in Montana, Dick Cheney's country, was willing to open up their prisons to these people. And I'm sure that we can I'm sure that we are big enough, America is strong enough. I don't care what the Republicans say. We are strong enough to handle all this stuff, and that just shows the weakness of the Republicans.
Thanks, caller. I know both guests want to jump in. We'll start here in Washington with Devon Chaffee.
I think that the caller's comments really highlight something very important, which is part of the benefit of using our federal criminal civilian justice system to try suspected terrorists is that it really denies them the warrior status that using a military system grants. It reduces them to what they are, which is criminals who have committed criminal acts of terrorism that are clearly violations of our federal code. And it denies them the warrior status that they seek to be elevated to in their cowardly acts of terror. Not only in addition to delegitimizing terrorists, using the federal criminal civilian justice system will have an amount of legitimacy that the military commission system that has been set up will never be able to have at this point. I completely agree with Mr. Stimson that the commissions have been a failure. And I believe that they are beyond recovery. They cannot be, and should not be revived at this point. They have failed, and they will not be able, any trial before that military commission system will not be perceived as legitimate in the eyes of the American public or in the eyes of the world. Instead, public opinion will be focused on the deficiency of that system, whatever those deficiencies might be.
Cully Stimson.
Tony from Louisiana is right. We can easily, safely and securely and humanely detain these guys in federal or military facilities here in the United States. There's no doubt about it. The question is the same one that the FBI director posed yesterday, and that is he's concerned that it would increase the threat level here in the United States. The fact is that we have successfully prosecuted a number of terrorists in federal district court. It's a system we should all be proud of. But understand also that although the commissions to date have been a failure, clearly the Obama administration thinks that by upgrading them, by codifying essentially what the military judges have been doing, saying we're not going to have evidence adduced by coercion, we're going to put the burden on the moving party to introduce hearsay to show it's reliable, to have judges conduct hearings to establish jurisdiction over these detainees. Those are all things that the Obama administration believes that commissions will add in its counterterrorism arsenal. He still needs to make the case to the American people, but let's all take politics out of this for a moment, because these matters are too serious to inject the poison of politics. Military detention of the enemy during wartime is a necessary and proper and legal tool under the Geneva Conventions for some number of these and probably others. But the question for the administration, I think the American people, is have we moved along so far now that we can't do that? I don't think the answer is yes. But the president needs to make the case. He's eloquent, and I think he will ultimately make the case to the American people.
We have a call from Detroit this morning. It's Rama, Republican line. Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, go ahead.
Yeah, I have three questions for that lady from Human Rights Group. I want to know why the rights of the terrorists are more important than the rights of the civilians who are being killed by them.
Let me stop you right there. You want to respond?
Well, certainly, we believe that suspected terrorists should be brought to justice, and that is, in fact, what the victims of terrorism deserve. They deserve to see the individuals that are suspected of having committed crimes against them to be brought to justice and held to justice for crimes that they may have committed. So I don't think this is a question of terrorist rights versus victims' rights. Clearly, it's incredibly important to human rights that we hold individuals that commit acts of terrorism to justice, and that we hold them accountable for their horrendous crimes.
Cully Stimson out in Denver. Here's a viewer who writes this question. What was the original plan regarding detainees when Gitmo was conceived? Was there any discussion about the legal process to be used? I never hear this discussed, they write, and I think it's important to revisit this.
I don't know. I wasn't in office at the time. I didn't even come to office until January of 2006. I've certainly talked to folks who were there at the time. My understanding is that they considered a variety of places, less than 10, that they looked at a variety of factors in establishing a strategic interrogation and detention facility outside of Afghanistan, which, by the way, the battlefield commanders wanted them out of there, and that access to federal courts, or lack of access to federal courts, was one of many of the considerations, and Guantanamo won out over all the other places. But I think she asked a good question. I don't know really the answer.
Cully Stimson was, from 2006 to 2007, Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Detainee Affairs, where he advised the Defense Secretary on detainee issues worldwide, including Guantanamo Bay, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We understand you resigned the position. Can you explain the circumstances for us?
Oh, yeah. I had foot and mouth disease. I made a comment, a stupid comment, that many took to suggest I was wanting corporations, law firms who work for certain corporations who were attacked on 9/11 to be boycotted. I didn't say that, but I could understand why it was played that way. I apologized in writing, unlike most people in Washington, and A lot of what I wanted to get done had been done. We had opened up Guantanamo for the world community. I took the 3 big European parliamentarian groups to Guantanamo. We did finally incorporate Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions in our detainee directive. We did finally publish the Army Field Manual on Interrogations. We did rewrite the Military Commissions Act of 2006, which ultimately I was against for lack of certain protections for detainees. So a lot of the things that I had been hired to do, sort of clean up detainee policy, get a lot of these fixes in place, had been done. And I felt like the distraction that was caused because of my comments, stupid they were, yes, was hindering my office in the department moving forward. So I made the independent choice just to step down and move on to the next phase of my career.
Devon Chaffee, before we get back to calls, we understand your boss at Human Rights First was over at the White House yesterday, and the president talked about something called a preventive detention system. What is that? What are we talking about here?
Well, I don't think it's clear exactly what was, on that particular point, what was discussed at the meeting. I think there have been a number of proposals, both through op-eds and law journal articles, for a new system of preventively detaining individuals without trial based on some assessment of that individual's dangerousness. There are a lot of concerns with the systems that have been proposed. Most of these proposals lack details. They don't define necessarily who in this hypothetical detention system would be detained or what type of procedures they would be provided. But if an individual is seriously a dangerous terrorist, then they have committed acts that can be prosecuted under our U.S. criminal code. And instead of creating a new system out of whole cloth, and we've seen through the military commission system how disastrous that can be, we should stick with the tried and true criminal justice system that we have come to rely upon.
Ole, Pennsylvania. Phoebe is on the line, Democrats line. Hi there.
Hi. I don't know the history, but I've been alive a while, and I remember the Bay of Pigs. It's about the time I got married. Why do we have Guantanamo? That's on the island of Cuba that for years wasn't even on the travel maps in the U.S. I mean, isn't that aggression on our part to maintain a military prison on an island that we have been hostile towards and not allowing trade with? This whole thing is troublesome. And as far as, you know, the detainees not being prisoners of war so they don't apply to the Geneva Conventions, that's bogus because this is a bogus war.
Cully, Stimson.
The lease arrangement between the United States and Cuba was actually signed in 1903, so a little bit before the Bay of Pigs, before the lady from Florida was married. And that lease has 5 conditions. Each side has to agree to, both sides have to agree to break the lease for it to go away. The U.S. Naval Station there has had a long and proud history, and it has had a variety of mission sets over the years. Remember, it was the indefinite detention facility established by President Bill Clinton in the 90s for about 75,000 Caribbean refugees. And so once the detainee mission that exists today leaves, whenever that is, the U.S. Naval Station will stay there. It is a strategically important place for us to be in the Caribbean, not only for counter-drug operations, but for other operations. And so I don't think anyone is suggesting that the base itself should close, just the detention mission itself. You know, Devon made an interesting point that she essentially, you know, you got to try them or set them free. That's not what Human Rights First said in their excellent May 2008 report called In Pursuit of Justice, Prosecuting Terrorism Cases in the Federal Courts. On page 5, they say some detainees may be properly held under, quote, the law of war for the duration of active hostilities to prevent them from turning to the battlefield without any effort by the government to file charges or impose punishments. So in other words, military detention, according to Human Rights First official own document, plays a part potentially in this conflict.
If I may, clearly Human Rights First believes that there is a very important role for detention in armed conflict. it's important to minimizing unnecessary casualties in war. It's an essential part of humanitarian law, and Human Rights First clearly recognizes that. I wasn't talking about detention in an armed conflict. It wasn't my understanding that the article was discussing detention in an armed conflict situation necessarily either. I mean, clearly there are forms of preventative detention that already exist in this country. There's immigration detention, and there are other forms of detention, including detention under the laws of war. What I think is being discussed is a potential new system that's based on, instead of involvement in an armed conflict, it's based on some assessment of dangerousness associated with terrorism. And it's a creation of some new form of preventive detention that I was meaning to refer to.
And one of the other headlines today making lots of news this morning, this is the Wall Street Journal version of the story. FBI arrests 4 men in bomb and missile plot. They arrested 4 and charged them with plotting to bomb a Bronx synagogue, New York City, and attack military planes at a New York National Guard air base. This was a criminal complaint unsealed last night. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District identified these men. They used an informant to monitor the men and help steer the plot for nearly a year. Lots of news coming out on this morning. Washington, D.C. now. Steve, you're on the Independent line. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning. This gentleman said that the POWs are brought over here were all Nazis. Well, that's not true. Some of them were, some of them were not. As far as Guantanamo is concerned, I have read that many of the people that were picked up on bounties were brought over there. As a matter of fact, one fellow from Germany wrote a book. He was held for 5 years, and the government, our government, knew 4 years before he was released that he was completely innocent, had nothing to do with terrorism. Thank you.
Cully, Stimson, want to take that?
Yeah, that's Murat Kurnaz, I believe, who he's referring to, who's back in Germany. There's no doubt that Steve is right to some extent. The administration picked up folks mainly in Afghanistan, and yes, bounties were paid for some, and that has a tradition steeped in the history of warfare. Bounties are paid throughout many wars over the years. So there's no nefarious, necessarily nefarious import just because bounties were paid. The question is, should you have a heightened suspicion of whether you have the right guy if a bounty's paid? In my mind, yes. Did they bring, of those 780 guys originally in 2002, some of the wrong guys there? Absolutely. And the administration started releasing some. Understand that this is a different type of enemy. This is not an enemy that carries arms openly, wears a uniform, fights for an organization with a proper chain of command, or for a country, for that matter, that's a contracting party to the Geneva Conventions. But look, these same problems exist today, Steve, and I think Devon would agree that we have to get this right. This administration now has the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of the previous administration and then go forward and craft a proper counterterrorism policy. And Devon is right again when she says she's not sure what they really mean by preventative detention. I don't know either because they haven't rolled out their plan. But if it's military detention, properly calibrated with procedural protections, with access to courts, with periodic review, that probably will pass muster with most people, depending on the details.
Devon Chaffee, can you remind us briefly where the Supreme Court has been on this issue of Guantanamo?
Well, there have been a number of Supreme Court cases. I think what's important, probably one of the most, well, we can discuss two of the most important cases. One is the Hamdan decision in 2006, which recognized that Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions did in fact apply to the detainees at Guantanamo. The administration had asserted that in fact Common Article 3, which is really the baseline for both trial procedures and for humane treatment, did not apply to the Guantanamo detainees, and Hamdan stated that in fact it did, which is what led to the Military Commissions Act and challenges of the Military Commission's procedures. Also, obviously, another very important case would be the Boumediene case, which stated that the federal judiciary did have jurisdiction to consider the habeas petitions. Habeas petitions are petitions that have been filed on behalf of some of the Guantanamo detainees challenging the legality of their detention. And what Boumediene stated was that the federal courts did have the ability to review these claims, and these claims are in fact going forward in D.C. District Court.
Let's hear from Albany, New York, Republican caller Michael. What would you like to say?
Good morning. How are you? I have a couple of questions for Ms. Chaffee, if it's all right.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, Ms. Chaffee, I'm 64 years old. I'm Jewish, and I served in Vietnam, a rarity. And when I see people like you, I get very nervous, because I would like you to take your entire group, plus the ACLU, plus the Socialist Democrat Party, go to Iran and tell Ahmadinejad, you can't chop off people's heads. Danny Pearl, the other Jewish journalist, where were you when this was happening?
Devon Chaffee.
Human Rights First clearly recognizes that acts of terror are also violations of human rights, and we have spoken out, and we will continue to speak out against a number of human rights violations, whether they, including violations of human rights that are committed through acts of terrorism. So I agree with the caller's concerns about ongoing human rights violations that are committed by terrorists and terrorist groups, and we will certainly continue to speak out against those types of crimes.
And a caller from here in Washington, D.C., Democrats line. Is it Kadra?
Yes, good morning.
Go ahead.
I was just, the last gentleman that spoke about the Muslim world is cutting hairs. That's their law. That's the Sharia law, because when they violate somebody, kill somebody, or steal, that's their law. Sharia laws, they punish or commit crime. Just like in the United States, if you commit crime, you go to jail for what you do. That's what it is. Second, I have a question for the gentleman. He said there was no such abuse going on in Detainee, the terrorist organization. If it was not such any crime committed against terrorists, why would the president not release the picture? Why would they destroy the videos? It was not such anything was going wrong.
Let's go to Cully Stimson in Denver. Want to respond to that?
Paul, I'm afraid I couldn't even hear her question because it was breaking up here. Did she ask something about videos? Could you rephrase her question?
She was breaking up. Are you still there, caller?
Yes.
Say it one more time, a little bit more slowly because the connection's a little bad.
I was hearing the gentleman earlier that he was saying that there was not such an abuse that was going on. Just only two people with enhanced irrigation was going on. But it was such a case like that was no any problem was going on. Why would they even destroy the videos, and the president did not release the picture?
Got it.
It was, yeah, okay.
Mr. Stimson, did you get it?
I got it, Paul. Thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, we've heard last year, especially, that there were certain videotapes of the waterboarding of some of the CIA high-value detainees. I think it was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Abu Zubaydah. Maybe Devon can help me out here with the right name. I can't recall. Those happened in detention facilities that have been undisclosed, not at Guantanamo, and the CIA apparently destroyed those tapes, and there's a federal prosecutor who's been appointed to investigate why and whether that constituted a crime. That investigation is ongoing, it's my understanding. To my knowledge, there were no ongoing videotaping of interrogations at Guantanamo.
Couple of tweets this morning. Just because we captured soldiers who were not practicing Geneva Convention rules doesn't mean we can break rules of law. And another viewer writes, why don't we use the World Court in The Hague? Richmond, Virginia, independent caller. Rock is on the line. Go ahead.
Yes, how you doing?
Go ahead.
Listen,
Fine.
my question is to your guests. Do they think the potential for a slippery slope is a very realistic possibility? My concern is when you talk about atrocity, when you talk about terrorism, and clearly when you look at the history of the United States in terms of, we're talking about defining this country to Panama, to Nicaragua, to Africa, to Middle East, wherever, that there's been a tremendous amount of terrorism inflicted against people around the world. And my concern is that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. My concern is that at some point, someone around the nation is going to say, you know what, this whole idea in terms of incarcerating people based upon this allegation of terrorism, maybe it's apropos also for the United States. And in fact, when people travel in the world, United States citizens being incarcerated on the guise of terrorism. And it seems to me that because we create this standard, this artificial standard.
Thank you, caller. Let's hear from our guest beginning here in Washington with Devon Chaffee.
Well, certainly I think that the caller was getting at an important point, which was that the United States should not treat terrorist suspects or individuals that it takes into custody in an armed conflict situation in any manner that it would not want Americans to be treated if they were taken into the hands of the enemy. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it is so important that the President has established a single standard of humane treatment for individuals in the custody of the United States. And I think that is a very important point to be recognized. As to one of the tweets that you mentioned, why doesn't the U.S. use the World Court in The Hague, assuming that's referring to the International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, the United States is not a party to that treaty. It is not clear what the President's policy will be towards the court and whether or not the current President might have a more favorable approach to the court than the previous presidency, but certainly we can't use a court if we're not a party to the convention that established it.
Cully, Stimson, you want to add anything before we move on?
Yeah, Rock, I think that's his name, put his finger on this concept of reciprocity. We should be doing the right things by detainees, because when our folks are captured, we want them to look to us and our treatment to say, okay, we'll only do the same thing. Now, we know the reality is that this enemy, in particular, is not going to follow the Geneva Conventions. They behead people on video and post it on websites. But that's not the point. We can't lower the moral bar just because this depraved enemy does what they do. The other point is that we finally, in 2006, took advantage of the practice that we had been doing in the Department of Defense, which is JAGs had routinely been advising commanders out in the field in Iraq and Afghanistan, because they're trained and we're trained to the Geneva Conventions to apply Common Article 3 in terms of treatment. And so we put that in a policy directive in 2006, the overarching detainee policy going forward. So at least in terms of DOD, I think we got it right and put it in policy in 2006. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, one of the major opponents to the International Criminal Court are the Judge Advocates General of the respective services, and that's because we have a very robust system under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and we want to not allow our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines be subject to world bodies and the whims of European investigative judges.
We have one last call for our guests. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Republican line. Jim, question or comment? Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to ask Ms. Chaffee what arm of the government that she is in.
Why do you ask?
Well, hey, I'm a taxpayer. I want see where my representation is going.
Well, you can be assured that your taxpayer dollars are not going towards my salary. Human Rights First doesn't take any money from the government, so I'm not an arm of the government, nor are we funded by the government. We're funded mostly by independent donors.
Final thoughts on this issue and where things might be headed?
Well, I certainly hope that the President in today's speech will be looking to the speech later today, and hopefully we will see a strong leadership and a restatement of the goals of closing Guantanamo and reestablishing the United States moral authority by closing the facility, and a commitment to trying suspected terrorists in our federal criminal justice system established for civilians here.
Cully, Stimson, final thought?
The President has the requirement and the duty under the Constitution to keep America safe. Any president is required to do that. I think this President, by his actions, not words, is taking his time. He's keeping all options on the table. He's using the Detainee Task Force and other internal task forces to look at the proper balance for counterterrorism strategy. He should keep on this table military detention properly calibrated. He should keep the terrorist surveillance program. He should keep military commissions upgraded if they can work. That's a big if. And the other things that the Bush administration did right, and reject those that they did wrong. But you're not going to get a lot of details today. You're going to get broad principles of how to maximize liberty and security.
We've been talking with Cully Stimson, who is in Denver, former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Detainee Affairs, and also Devon Chaffee, Advocacy Council for Human Rights First. Thanks to both of you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We have about an hour and a half left in this Thursday edition of the Washington Journal. I'll tell you about our upcoming guest. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat from Texas, is coming up in just a couple of minutes. Topic here is funding for the Transportation Security Administration. And then a little bit later, around 9 o'clock Eastern Time, Bing West will join us, former Reagan administration Assistant Defense Secretary, just back from Afghanistan. Will give us his impressions and where things might be headed there. This is Washington Journal. We'll be right back.
Is there anything that you regret writing? What is your opinion on same-sex marriage?